Well, hello and welcome to Summer 2020 Life University Week 2 Assembly. I'm Dr. Gilles LaMarche, Vice President of University Advancement and your Assembly Coordinator. I'm really honored once again to have as our guest speaker a gentleman who has dedicated more than 50 years to the chiropractic profession. He has served in multiple capacities, from a practicing chiropractor to a businessman involved in the chiropractic profession, to serving as president of 2 chiropractic institutions, and now serving as the Chancellor Emeritus of Life University. Please welcome the one and only Dr. Guy Riekeman.
Thank you, Gilles. Much appreciated. And the feeling of respect is mutual. I'd like to start today with a real simple quote from John Lewis, which was, get in some good trouble. Get in to some good trouble. I had a presentation that I was going to do, and then on Friday, the entire thing changed when John Lewis, the senator from Georgia, passed away. And while today is not about politics, and I don't want to make it as such, I'm sure there are many things that I agreed and disagreed with John Lewis about. I do know that he was a great friend of Life University and frequented the campus earlier on in his career. And I had the opportunity of meeting with him and having lunch one day to talk about some of the issues in our profession and about Life University. And he was very aware of the college, and since he spent a good portion of his life here representing from the mid-'80s the state of Georgia, he obviously was very deeply involved in understanding of some of the characters at Life University. So it's not that I want to talk about John's politics today. As he passed away last Friday, it reminded me that here was an individual that represented commitment and passion. Commitment and passion that doesn't come from emergency, doesn't come from necessarily being in the right place at the right time. It's a passion that comes from something you believe in so deep in your soul and your heart that you can't let go of. I spoke at graduation and talked about the responsibility that we have to each other, if you will, being citizens of a state, of a country, of a world. And really it is the height of what we would call a tribe. When I look at my friends in the Southwest and Western United States, my Native American friends, and I have a good friend by the name of Sonny, who's a Lakota Sioux chief. They understood the importance of a tribe for their survivability, for their health, for their well-being. And of course, that means that they had certain responsibilities to each other. And you know what? We do still, even today, have responsibilities in this tribe, even though it's a separated tribe here in the United States these days, in very obvious and sort of violent terms. But there are 4 responsibilities in citizenship, and they identify 4 different levels of citizenship. And the first one is, if you're going to be a citizen, you have to hold an opinion about the things that are going on. You have to be clear in how you think about these issues. You have to be able to, in your own mind, and certainly in communicating with other people, be able to create a logical, rational case as to why you have an opinion and what that opinion is, and to be able to articulate it in a meaningful way. And you say, well, what the heck does that have to do with me as a chiropractic student? And the answer is, we have issues that are going on in healthcare today. We're seeing it very obviously with the opioid crisis going on, which, even though it's become publicly sort of in the background at this time because of COVID, I just read yesterday that opiate addiction and the distribution and prescription of opioids has actually increased, not decreased, but increased during the COVID crisis. And then, of course, with the COVID crisis, we have a little bit different view at Life University with our vitalistic philosophy of that crisis. I don't want to minimize it, and I'm sure some of you have been personally impacted by this. But, when Pasteur gave us the the three criteria for producing disease. One, you have to have a germ. Two, how virulent is the germ? And three, what is the quality of the host? Obviously, as vitalists, our primary concern is the quality of the host. We can't control the virus necessarily. We can certainly, on a short-term basis, affect who gets it, but ultimately, we can't control the virus nor the virulence of that virus. So really the issue for us becomes, what is the quality of the host? And it's interesting that a lot of people are being infected with the COVID virus, and yet the majority of them fight it off. And the question we would ask is, rather than just trying to find out how to fight the virus, what is it about people that are able to fight it off, that have immune systems that are able to handle it? And why can't we have a national debate about that? Because it certainly is something that people could do for themselves and as organizations to protect themselves if we knew what those kinds of factors were. And of course, obviously, on a very personal level, I believe strongly that chiropractic has a role in the quality of the host and their immune system. So, what is your opinion? Can you hold a rational discussion about it? Have you thought it through in a rational way rather than the emotion of headlines that we see invading our news feeds day in and day out? So our first responsibility as a citizen is to hold an opinion that has a rational basis. The second one is to go out and vote. We're getting ready to have an election here in November that's very important. Have you registered? Are you ready to go out and vote? It doesn't take much to be able to go out and voice your opinion along with the rest of the tribe on a particular issue or candidate. The third one is, are you willing to invest time, effort, energy, and money into the things that are important to you, the things that you believe in? We're going to talk about John Lewis's life in just a moment and some of the things that came along. But it's more than just sitting in the background and being an armchair quarterback. Are you willing to go out and fight for the things that you believe in? And then the fourth or highest level of citizenship is the willingness to even be able, or the willingness to give up your own life if necessary for what you believe in. And we see that oftentimes, certainly in the military, where people are on the front lines fighting for what they believe in and to defend our right as citizens to live in a free democratic society. But how far are you willing to go really for the things that are important to you? So again, I don't want to talk about politics today. I want to talk about citizenship, about passion, about what you believe in, how you hold your opinions. And I'm going to ask you to look at John Lewis's life along with me, because one of the other issues that I think that's critical for us as individuals is about fighting for the things that we think are right. And John Lewis was a fighter for the evil of segregation. That's what his life was committed to. And I've seen other people that have that type of commitment. Mother Teresa, for example, fought for the evil that she saw of people who were poor and not being taken care of. Nelson Mandela had his fight in South Africa. Candy Lightner, whose daughter was killed by a drunk driver, started an organization called MAD, the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and spent and still does her life traveling throughout the country, meeting in the middle of night with legislators as they're getting ready to vote on various drunk driving laws in their particular state. We see people like Lech Walesa in Poland, who in his nonviolent fight against communism was just a simple blue-collar shipyard worker who believed in something and was ultimately named president of his country, as was one of my favorite heroes, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, who was an educator, who in the spring in the 1960s stood up to the Russians who came in to suppress the student movement for freedom in Czechoslovakia, later became the president of his country and the spokesperson. Once the Berlin Wall had come down, became the spokesperson for the rebuilding of communist Europe. So one of the things that I've always been amazed about with these people is that obviously in the end of their lives, when they hold these positions, such as the president of a country, we look at them and think that there's something unique about them that somehow they had some kind of special background that created an environment for them to be these leaders. But in actual fact, they were school teachers, blue-collar shipyard workers, mothers, lawyers. They were a simple nun. They were just people, average people like you and me, that one, had something they believed in, were willing to commit with passion to what they believed in, and were willing to give up their life for what they believed in. And because of that, they had a huge impact on our culture and on our view of the world. And so what about John Lewis? Because to some degree, I'm sure he fits into this particular issue. Obviously, the climate of the time when John Lewis was born in 1940 was a civil rights situation that was different than the one today. There was no voting for African Americans in 1940. There wasn't the ability to go to an educational institution. I remember in my teens watching the National Guard being dispersed by John Kennedy to Alabama, and the governor of Alabama standing up and refusing to allow any African American students into the University of Alabama. And the National Guard had to go there and escort on national television the first African American woman student into the University of Alabama. This was a time when it wasn't about what kind of rights you had. This was a time when there were no rights for most of the African Americans, especially in the South, where this was more acute. And so John Lewis was born into this particular time. He became one of 6 players, and I'll talk about it later, that really headed the civil rights movement. And in 1963, the culmination of this, and then we're going to flash back at some issues, more than 500,000 people gathered on the lawn in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure many of you have seen the entire speech of Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, that day, or at least pieces of it, which was a march on the Washington, D.C. that literally stirred the consciousness of America. John Lewis happened to be the youngest leader of the civil rights movement at this particular time. He was the organizer at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which he headed. And he also, interestingly enough, spoke just prior to Martin Luther King in 1963 on the Mall in Washington, D.C. He was one of the original freedom riders, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. In 1965, he was on the front line of the march in Selma, Alabama, across the bridge, which we'll also talk about, in which he was brutally attacked, as were others. And you then flash forward almost 50 years to 2011, when President Obama was giving him the National Medal of Freedom. And Obama said this about him. He said, "When parents teach their children what is meant by courage, the story of John Lewis will come to mind. An American who knew that change could not wait for some other person or some other time, whose life is a lesson in the fierce urgency of now." And I love that line, a life that is a lesson in the fierce urgency of now. This couldn't be put off any longer. So here's the story, if you will, of John Lewis. He was born in Troy, Alabama in February of 1940. He was one of 10 children. His dream, his whole life, was to be a preacher. In fact, it was reported that when he was a youngster, every night he would gather the chickens in the chicken pen and he would provide sermons for them. At the time, his parents warned him that it was dangerous to make any waves, especially in Alabama. But in 1954, when Brown versus Education came down, interestingly enough, because of where he was in the Deep South, nothing changed in his town. As a teen, he actually met Rosa Parks. I know that some of you are perhaps too young to remember some of these names, but Rosa Parks was a moment in time, a woman, an African-American woman, who stood up and refused to ride in the back of a bus and sat at the front of the bus, and it sparked a lot of what we now know as the civil rights movement. John Lewis met and knew Rosa Parks. He was an intimate friend of Dr. Martin Luther King's. In 1957, he enrolled at the American Baptist Theological Seminary to realize his dream as a minister. And in 1958, he had met leaders of the civil rights movement, one of them who passed away last Friday also on the same day, C.T. Vivian, who was 95 years of age. And we'll put these names in perspective in just a moment. He also in 1958 launched the Student National Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, and joined it, if you will, as an offshoot of Dr. Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference that originated here just a few blocks from downtown or midtown Atlanta at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. The first sit-in that he was involved in was actually the very first sit-in that they had organized as a way of bringing the evil of segregation to the forefront. It was at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in February of 1960. They began to do these sit-ins at lunch counters across the South, and many of them turned violent. In one case, John Lewis remembers that the owner of the Woolworths brought out a canister and fumigated them while they were sitting at the counter. And John Lewis's comment in one of the books that was written about him was, this individual didn't even see us as being human beings. We were not human to him, he said. As they pushed deeper into the nonviolent movement, and I want to make a point about the nonviolent movement because it was very similar to what Gandhi did in India to have India become a free country and separated from the British Empire. The nonviolent part of the movement was just as critical as the movement itself. It was the reflection of that movement. It wasn't their why, but it was their how, if you will allow me. And that how was a reflection of what they believed represented their moral values. I remember in the movie Gandhi, which is a phenomenal film, there was a time when the movement in India was becoming violent. There had been some particular outbreaks of violence against people and property. And Gandhi actually shut the movement down. And his comment was, if we gain our freedom through violence, what does that say about us and what kind of a country would we inherit? So nonviolence was a critical component, especially in Dr. King's approach to the civil rights movement. So when these people were being fumigated, when they were being attacked, as we'll talk about in Selma, Alabama, they didn't fight back as they didn't in Gandhi's movement in India. So John Lewis said, as they pushed deeper into deeper with their nonviolent protests, he said, we were met with increasingly more violent reactions from the people that this was challenging. In 1961, they headed south with the first Freedom Riders movement. The Freedom Riders was an attempt to integrate the bus terminals throughout the United States, but particularly in the South. And one of the first terminals that they went to in Rock Hill, South Carolina, John Lewis was violently attacked. In fact, he suffered he was knocked unconscious and actually suffered a skull fracture. And later in Montgomery, Alabama, they were jailed. The Freedom Riders were, but within a short period of time, the Interstate Travel Agency had integrated all bus terminals and public transportation terminals throughout the United States. So as they were doing each of these things, sitting in at counters, the Freedom Riders going from bus station to bus station, they were having an impact and beginning to slowly make changes and get feedback. In 1963, as head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he was part of an organization of 6 people that literally became the consciousness and the program development, the strategic planning group, if you will, of the civil rights movement. There was Whitney Young, who was the head of the National Urban League. Martin Luther King, of course, with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Philip Randolph, who was the labor leader. He was a remarkable individual. Philip Randolph had been trying to organize a march on Washington, D.C. since 1941. It took 22 years in order for that dream to become a reality in 1963 with the March on Washington, D.C. There was James Farmer Jr., who was the head of CORE. And of course, the NAACP's leader, Roy Wilkins. And so these 6 people became the social strategic organizing movement for the civil rights movement. In the speech that John Lewis gave just prior to Martin Luther King's, which many people felt was even a more impactful and call to action than Dr. King's speech was that day, John Lewis coined the term, "The revolution is at hand." His speech was one, as a young individual, very much getting to the streets and amplifying the revolution. Dr. King and some of the other leaders that I've just mentioned who were there that day speaking felt that the speech would invite or would incite rioting, would incite violence. And so they took John Lewis aside and asked him to calm down some of the points in his speech and certainly some of the verbiage and rhetoric. He made some small changes, but essentially gave the speech that he wanted. And it was considered one of the greatest speeches of the civil rights movement. It was the speech with teeth, as they talked about in books for years to come after that. In 1964, as I mentioned, the Freedom Riders were moving across the South, and they started a new group called the Freedom Summer. And the Freedom Summer was designed to register and educate voters who at that particular time had never cast a vote in their lifetime. And even though they had the right to vote, the laws that were created throughout the United States, and again, particularly in the South, were so ominous that they essentially eliminated the ability of poor people, people of color, et cetera, to have the ability to go out and vote. And so they began this march. And of course, this really struck. This was more than sitting at a counter. This was more than integrating a bus station. This was giving people the power to change the leaders in their state, the leaders in their community. And it was a strike at the heart of those who were trying to protect segregation in the South. It was so violent, in fact, that some good friends of John Lewis's, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney, were brutally and viciously killed, and their bodies were not uncovered until some time later. It was a time of not just social protest and violence. This was a time where people were literally putting their lives on the line. As I talked about, they didn't just have an opinion, they didn't just vote, they hadn't just committed time, effort, and energy to the process. These people were putting their lives on the line for something they believed in. Interestingly, it wasn't just African Americans in the South. Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner were students that had come from the South, I believe from the New York area, to be part of this movement. So this was a moral movement that was not restricted to any particular ethnicity. This was a moral movement of what was right for human beings. That particular event pushed Lyndon Johnson to create civil rights legislation. In 1968, we started to see some violent break in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was assassinated. In 1966, Stokely Carmichael, again, probably not a name that most people would know unless you grew up in that time, took over control of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. If you want to know who Stokely Carmichael was, he was the one that created the statement Black Power that we saw being expressed in the Olympics when two athletes were standing on the stage having won the gold medal and a silver medal, and they raised their hand in protest, which was the sign of Black Power. In 1968, John Lewis went to work for Robert F. Kennedy for his presidential campaign and was actually with Robert Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles when he was assassinated in the kitchen that evening by Saran Saran. In 1970, they began to organize voter education projects. And in 1986, he ran and won a seat in the Georgia, for the state of Georgia for the House, and has been in Washington, D.C. ever since. So a couple of comments just in wrapping this up. Interestingly enough, there was a gentleman I read about, his name was Elwyn Wilson. Elwyn Wilson. Elwyn Wilson had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan and had been at the protest, the sit-in at one of the Woolworths, and was one of the people that violently attacked John Lewis when he was a teen and leading the SNCC. Elwyn Lewis, later in his life, much later in his life, in fact, just shortly before his death, had a transformation of consciousness and a realization that he had been on the wrong side during the civil rights movement. You have to understand what a major transformation that would be. Elwyn Lewis actually traveled to Washington, D.C., and sat down with John Lewis and apologized to him. Elwyn Wilson and John Lewis became good friends. For a time, in fact, they went out and stumped together, talking about the civil rights movement, talking about current legislation. But their appearance together, when they would make these presentations, was a reflection of one of the most powerful human notions and experiences, and that's the experience of forgiveness. John Lewis said that Elwyn Wilson was the only person in his entire lifetime that ever came forward and said that he apologized for some of his actions during the civil rights movement. John Lewis, shortly before he passed away, said that giving up on my dreams is not an option for me. He also went on to say this: our struggle is not a struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never be afraid to make some noise and get in some good trouble. You know what? We as chiropractors are in the struggle of a lifetime. Not a day, not a week, not a month, not a year. We're here to bring a new idea about health and what it can mean for humanity. And interestingly enough, we didn't come together to build a profession. We came as passionate individuals, visionaries who wanted to serve people, to serve them in a new and meaningful way, to serve them by releasing their own healing power, to empower them to take back control of their lives and the lives of their children. So as we are going through this time of COVID and being separated, realize that you're an intimate, necessary, and respected part of a tribe. That tribe uses Life University at this particular time to reflect the ideas of a movement, which again is not something that's going to last a week, a month, or a year. It's the struggle of a lifetime to bring new ideas, to change culture, to make a difference in people's lives. As that beautiful Apple commercial said, the people that are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones that actually do. So while you're getting your education, getting your practice set up, while you're establishing what you need to do to take care of yourselves and to ultimately serve people, always remember that ultimately we're in this to change the world. Keep your heads up. We'll all be back on campus in the near future, and we'll celebrate our movement. Thanks for joining me today.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Riekeman. I don't know the students listening in if you have a pad and paper, a pad and a pen next to you, but I can tell you that I took a lot of notes during this 40 minutes or so. And I think some of the highlights were really, the power of forgiveness, giving up on my dream is not an option. So I would hope that you would take that message home yourself, realizing that you have a dream. You have a dream that brought you to chiropractic. And giving up on the dream is not an option. And, another quote, never be afraid to make some noise. You're going to be asked to make noise as a chiropractor. Excuse me. I've been a chiropractor for 41 years. I didn't make a lot of noise the first few years, but I've made a lot of noise since. And I can tell you it's been a lot of fun because, as Dr. Riekeman said in closing, we come together to serve people in a new and meaningful way. And let's always remember that learning is a continuum. So on that note, once again, Dr. Riekeman, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for sharing your wisdom, your passion, and certainly the experience that you've had that has allowed you to share these messages with deep truth, authenticity, and your genuine kindness. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure, Jill. Thank you.